Thank you, Zoom. Zoom won't let you sneak up on anybody like that. All right, guys. So this morning, I'm going to use a little bit more of the video guided discussion. I struggled to find exactly which one to use here, but I think I found a good combination. And so let me tell you where I hope that we go this morning so that it makes a little sense in terms, because it's going to feel at times like it's a little bit reviewish, and it will be. But I'm trying to set the context for two things that are coming up and looking again at the historical understanding. So going back to the chart that we've been using, we've been wandering around in this area here, what's been going on with Baptists and Congregationalists. And if you recall, this connection that exists between the church in England and the Reformed church below, we've talked a lot about how there's the interaction that's going back and forth. Last 2 weeks, we covered sort of the concepts behind the formation of what we know as modern Baptists, with a couple of different ways of looking at that, the influence of Anabaptists, the Baptist movement inside of the English or Anglican church. And then we also last week sort of concluded, if you remember, with coming over and talking a little bit about the Baptist church coming to the New World of the form of Roger Williams and the First Baptist Church that was really formed there in Rhode Island. In colonial America. I always struggle with what to call it. Dealt with that yesterday when I was recording something that related to the French and Indian War, what exactly to call it. We're going to do today is go back a little bit with using some of the Ryan Reeves video to do something of an overview of the 17th century, the 17th century being the 1600s. So this is going to cover some of the stuff that we've already talked about. But what's included in that I want to set up is some of the philosophical things that are happening as we move into that period of time. We've covered a lot of the history, and we've covered a lot of the theology that goes on there in the early 17th century. But there's bigger philosophical things that are going on that start to have an impact on theology. And so if you're familiar with the term the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, we're going to start slipping into that. And it's important for us to spend some time talking about that, because that's really the rise of the tension is too kind of a word, clash is too strong of a word perhaps, but the conjunction of theology and science as they start to be complementary to each other, but also contesting against each other, if that makes any sense. And so understanding that philosophical background of what's going on in the 17th century becomes very important, because it's informing what's going on in theology at the same time. And we'll even talk about, for example, why do we start having all of this explosion of confessions, these written documents? Well, part of that is it's just tied to the actual way that science is working then, where there's this desire to document things. So we'll even see that influenced here. So before we get going, any questions about anything we covered last week? Oh, there we go. That's what I was looking for. All right. If not, I'm going to go ahead and magically attempt to get us over to first video here. This is going to run for about 10 minutes with a couple of stops in the middle. And again, let me know when you've got the audio so that I know that it's working right.
In this lecture, we're looking at the 17th century as a whole, pulling the lens back and trying to get a sense of all the complexity that goes on here in this century, so that when we dive into specifics for this century, we can have a real grasp of what's going on all around Europe and into the New World. And really the reason for this lecture is because too often we tend to compartmentalize things that need to be kept together. We have maybe a sweep of the history in our mind, how we go from one generation of things to the next. We also have another compartment in our mind at times as to great names, great figures, great movements, but we don't always put these together. In my case, the first time I realized this was when I was a new student to the subject of history. I had in my mind two separate categories of the Reformation and the Renaissance. This was how I was taught it, When we were discussing the Renaissance, it was art, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Donatello, and so on. And it was this wonderful flowering of the arts and of letters. In another space in my mind, you might say, I had the Reformation, Luther, Calvin, and others. And then one day I sat down and I started to sketch out a timeline of all the things that are happening in and around the Reformation. And it was, frankly, eye-opening to realize that Michelangelo in particular, just to take one case, actually lived and painted well beyond the Reformation, which means that he was there painting and sculpting and doing all these things while Luther was up in Germany founding a Reformation movement. And just taking that as a microcosm of the problem here, when we look at the 17th century, we don't always appreciate the fact that there was so much upheaval, so much change, both in terms of culture and politics and the landscape of the world, but also in terms of the intellectual world, biblical studies, and theology. Just to put it bluntly, the 17th century begins with Elizabeth I in the Shakespearean age, and it ends with the Salem witch trials. Elizabeth dies in 1603, and the Salem witch trials are in the 1690s. Now, for most of us, those two worlds are significantly apart. We don't see them as part of a continuum. We don't notice all of the complexities that lead from one to the next. So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the big picture. What happens all throughout Europe, and what are some of the names and the events and the turning points that historians always find so interesting and complex? Well, we can begin with some of the good things that are invented or discovered here in the 17th century. Two of the most important, ice cream and coffee. You see a real flowering of trade, meaning things from one part of Europe or one part of the world, and therefore the inventions or the discoveries from one part of the world begin to really intermesh with other cultures. Part of this is...
Let's stop there for a second. It's an obvious thing, but it's so obvious it probably is worthy of stating. If goods are moving back and forth, meaning there's trade going on, what else is moving back and forth when trade is happening?
Religion thoughts.
Religion and just ideas in general.
Yeah.
So, the fact that there's the fact that there's physical things that are moving back means that there are non-physical things that are moving back and forth. And again, that's obvious. We realize that. We don't need to be really told that, but just be thinking through about how much of an explosion of mobility is actually happening in a way that hasn't existed before. Not that people weren't getting around in the old world, but they're getting around between the old world and the new world, which also makes it easier to get around in the old world. So just recognizing that one of just the inventions or one of the notable changes of the 17th century starts to become the mobility of people, the mobility of goods, and also the mobility of ideas.
Is revolutions in technology related to travel. Part of this is the fact that the New World really expands and mingles together all kinds of cultures from Europe as a whole. I mean, if you just think about the eastern coast, the colonies, and then you think about the countries that land there, thereby putting culture after culture side by side, you begin to get a sense of this. Scottish and English folks will land in certain parts of New England and suddenly be living right alongside German folks, Scandinavian folks, all kinds of things. And so the 17th century, in a manner of speaking, is a real flowering of trade, engagement, and invention. It's during the 17th century, for example, that Kepler and Galileo and a number of figures who will revolutionize the way we see the heavens began to do their writing and at times come into controversy with the Catholic Church, Galileo in particular. As you carry forward, though, into the later part of the 17th century, 1687, Isaac Newton, the man whose theory of gravitation, amongst other things, came to define centuries of how the scientific world engaged with the physical surrounding world around them. Now, the history of science, of course, is always told as if it immediately was opposed to the church and to theology. The story of Galileo is often a case in point. He is put on trial and he is under fire for his scientific discoveries related to the solar system. But what's going on here is not yet overtly hostile to either theology, whether it be Catholic or Protestant. Just take Isaac Newton, for example. One of the more recent things that has been argued and pointed out is that Isaac Newton, believe it or not, wrote more pages on subjects related to theology in the Bible than he actually did on science. And he had.
Does that come as a surprise to you that Newton actually wrote more biblical commentary than he did scientific works?
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, he wrote extensively. I read some of the stuff about 6 or 7 months ago as we were getting ready for this study. I read one of his, I think it was a commentary on the John's Gospel, but he actually, and he wrote a lot scientifically, Principia being the primary thing where the gravitation and the laws of motion are laid out. That's in the late, I think it's in 1687, if I have my date correct in my head. I know it's in the 1680s. He wrote a lot scientifically, but he actually wrote more theologically, just to show that, which is making Dr. Reeves' point here, is that, you know, we tend to immediately think of that science and, as he pointed out, that science and religion were in conflict. Initially, they're not as much in conflict as one may believe. In fact, that's actually a later sort of revisionist way of looking back at the explosion of the scientific method and the scientific revolution.
Has some strange views here and there. He challenges some of the understanding of the Trinity and so on. I would say he was a good theologian, but the traditional idea is that it's in the 17th century that it all goes downhill really fast. Suddenly the church is on the fringe and this quote unquote scientific revolution elbows out faith. Well, that's on the horizon, but it's not in play yet. The 17th century is something of the high water mark, just as we saw with trade and other types of things related to food and beverage, where you see science and theology and all kinds of these things mingling and commingling and coming together. In theology and philosophy, you have an equal amount of flowering and interaction. In the world of theology, you have the rise of what we call the confessional age, as well as scholasticism, Protestant scholasticism to be specific. The confessional age is an age in which...
Let me, because I didn't spend as much time as I probably should have back when we were going through this leading up to Luther. Scholasticism, is that a term that needs a little fleshing out for folks? What it means? It's a technical term, scholasticism.
Never heard of it.
Okay, scholasticism was going on primarily inside the Catholic Church right before the time of Luther. In fact, Luther is sort of influenced by this. They had rediscovered many of the classical Greek pieces of literature in such a way that there was the ability to read Greek, thus the original New Testament, in its more native Greek because of what was discovered there. The scholastic movement was really bringing a new form of educational focus in, but it was contained within Catholic circles. So we didn't spend a lot of time talking about him because we didn't go down that path because we looked more at Luther, but Erasmus is a name that you've heard over and over again. He is probably the leading Catholic scholastic. And then the other term that's used there is humanism. We did talk a little bit about that, not meaning humanism in the sense of being atheistic humanism, which part of that grows later. We're going to be leading into that here, but the idea of bringing in more classical thought to the understanding of theology and religion. So some of like the writings of Aquinas and Erasmus, and those were in the scholastic tradition. So when he's talking about here about scholasticism, and then he makes the particular point of saying Protestant scholasticism, is that he's pointing out traditionally that means that the movement that went on inside the Catholic Church, but a similar movement went on inside of the various parts of the Protestant movement. Does that make sense? It's basically applying, because of the Renaissance, and again, tied to the Renaissance, as he was just talking about, it's applying some of the things that had been lost to some degree during the Dark Ages and bringing them back and applying them to what they were studying and what they were looking at.
Just about every denomination at some point, or every branch of the Protestant faith, is beginning to really come down and to crystallize its confessional views on things. So in the Reformed world, you see things like the Synod of Dort, which fought against Arminianism, and we're going to look at that in greater detail later. You also see the rise of the Westminster Confession during the English Civil War, by far the most extensive and elaborate confession from the Reformed world. But there are others. All of this is shaped, though, by a real heady mixture of scholasticism with Protestant theology. Now, we said when we were looking at Luther that not everyone who is scholastic is by default theologically suspect. Scholasticism is more of a method. It's more like a robust version of systematic theology. Well, this begins to really flower here. Now, a lot of the names that are associated with either Lutheran scholasticism or Reformed scholasticism, etc., are not names that we know a great deal of. But one of the things that begins to happen to Protestant theology is it begins to move from a more humanist base of education to, again, this scholastic base. There has been a lot of fighting and infighting, depending on the denomination or the historian involved, as to whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing. So take the one issue we've looked at once or twice, the dreaded question of Calvin and Calvinism. Well, as scholasticism unfolds and as it begins to develop, you see Reformed folks discussing things in a new way and with a new depth and with a new focus on clarity and scholastic rigor, to a point that Calvin as a humanist is not always willing to go. Now, the question is always, okay, different methodology, it's going to feel different, it's going to sound different, but is it different theology? And we're going to look at some of this as we go through. So the Synod of Dort discussing something that we would later call limited atonement. Well, Calvin himself doesn't really discuss this, or if he even mentions something anywhere close to this idea, he is unwilling to discuss it. He, being a humanist, is more linguistic, historical, grammatical. Scholastics, though, will delve a bit deeper into certain theological areas. In the realm of philosophy, you do see a tussle, a back and forth between those who are attempting to ground Christian philosophy on a firm base and those who strike out for new ground. In the country of
I'm going to pause there for a second. He just used a term, Christian philosophy. When you hear that, what pops into your head? I know what pops into mine. I'm curious to know what pops into your head.
How do they mix?
Yeah, we often don't use those in the exact same. We want to think of our Christian thought as being what? Theology, right?
Yeah.
And we don't want to use the term philosophy to describe what we think about our Christianity, because somehow philosophy comes from a secular bent, or at least that's the way that it works in my head. But the realization that our theology, a biblically based theology, does contain a philosophy, and understanding that there is, philosophy is a broader, bigger question. And in fact, one of the reasons we're going down this path and talking about this is it's really relevant to modern thought, even what's now referred to as postmodern thought, which is what is one of the goals of philosophy? What does philosophy try to accomplish? In fact, the word comes from philosophy means, translated from, means lover, means the love of wisdom. Philo, love, soph being wisdom or knowledge. So it's the love of knowledge. So what is the purpose of philosophy?
To try to explain life.
To try to explain things. And ultimately, it's to get down to what is true.
Right.
If that makes sense. So, I remember having to take an intro to philosophy course in college. Some of you may have done the same or been exposed to it in other ways. I certainly remember the 3 different political philosophy classes that I had, including Introduction to Political Philosophy. And everything there was about trying to get down to what is, truth. This is not a new modern concept. Aristotle was trying to get down to that, coming off the coming on the heels of Plato, coming on the heels of Socrates, who's coming on the heels of other stuff, just going back to our Greek philosophical roots. But then you come down to the Middle Ages and you have Christian philosophy. You have Kant and you have Aquinas and others. And the goal of philosophy is to determine what is true. And so theology, because it's about who God is really the ultimate form of philosophy. What is the truth about God? The Enlightenment, we're going to spend a good bit of time talking about it here because it's going to be the backdrop for the next little sections that we go through, the further development of Baptist thought, the rise of Methodism, and then coming down to modern understanding of where the church has become. There is a tremendous amount of tension now between our theology and philosophy. If I use the term postmodern, what does that mean? Because I haven't defined what that means. What do you hear when I say postmodern?
Early years.
Okay. Recently, you might have heard the term used a lot, relativism.
Yes.
And what is relativism?
The truth is relative, that there is no such thing as absolute truth.
Right. This idea of relative truth versus absolute truth. So another
Yes.
way of describing that, Doug, would be, well, there's my truth and there's your truth. And both of them are equally true. Would be one way of looking at that in the ultimate postmodern sense.
Yes.
And how does that struggle when compared to theology?
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
Because there's only one truth.
Right, in a big way, right?
Anyway,
Doug hit it on the head. Absolute truth versus multiple relative truths, right?
So relativism
Is a
is
big
postmodern.
is a huge part of being postmodern. And such to the point of it's very difficult to have a deep philosophical discussion without being able to tie off to something that is foundationally true, right? That you can agree upon. Otherwise, everything is just relative. I was thinking about coordinate systems because we were looking at something that's having to deal with some latitude and longitude this week. And, you know, you've heard me say this before. Somebody told me this once, and it just becomes more and more true by the day. You know, the best thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. Because there are literally 5 or 6 different ways that latitude and longitude can be expressed. There's decimal latitude and longitude and degrees, minutes, and seconds, and a combination of degrees, minutes, and seconds where you use decimals. And then if you look at Google Maps, for example, if you put in laps and longs there, they don't put north and south for latitude or east and west for longitude. West longitude is just negative longitude. So if you put in, we're approximately 30 degrees north latitude. And by the way, south latitude is just negative latitude. And I'll show you where I'm bringing this back to, is that roughly here, we're pretty close to we're 30 degrees north. We're almost on it, 29-ish and a fraction is for most of us here where we're going to be. And we're, you know, somewhere moving towards around, you know, 90-ish degrees west. But if you put in 30, 90 in Google Maps and you don't put the negative in front of the 90, you'll end up way on the other side of the world. Because I did that this week. So I was putting in a coordinate and I forgot to put the negative in when I was using Google Maps just to spot where something was. And I'm like, that's not where I expected to be. Oh, you got to stick the negative in front to make it west for the longitude. Here's the deal, though, regardless of which one of those systems and the positive and the negative, how does latitude and longitude work? There is a defined 0, 0. Now,
what happens when polar north changes?
Well, that's a whole other thing. And even the realization there that the geographic north and the magnetic north are not exactly at the same place. In fact, the magnetic North Pole tends to wander around a little bit, makes it even more complicated. In fact, when you really get into the whole concept of putting longitude on a globe, it's actually an interesting thing. But the reason I use this as an example is that what is zero longitude? Anybody remember from school?
Equator. Well, no, the Greenwich.
No, zero latitude is the equator.
Yeah,
Zero,
Greenwich meridian.
Yeah, the Greenwich meridian. It runs through Greenwich, England.
Yeah.
And it's referred to as the prime meridian. Our time system, you probably are familiar with the term GMT, which is Greenwich Mean Time. Why does that line run through Greenwich, England?
Because the English established the measurement system.
Exactly right. Because an English guy was the one who figured out how to use clocks in such a way to be able to track longitude. And the clock that they coordinated against was the observatory clock at the Royal Observatory, which happened to be in Greenwich, England. And so our entire system of latitude and longitude, which we use a lot, is a form of truth, but it's actually a form of relative truth. Someone had to decide. It's absolute truth in the sense of once it's decided, it is what it is. You know how many degrees, minutes, seconds, whether you're measuring that in decimals or minutes and seconds, you are east and west of that line of longitude, or north and south of the latitude line, which is the equator. But there had to be an agreement on what would be zero longitude. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It is not, it is agreed, it is understood, but it's not absolute in the sense of being absolute. It's not like God came down and spray painted a line on the earth saying this is where it is. We had to come to an agreement on that. And so that's the reason I use that as an example. First of all, I encountered that this week, is it's very scientific in its orientation, in the sense of science has established that as fact, therefore it is fact. If you've go ahead.
So that was decided without any theological fault.
Correct. There is no absolute truth to zero longitude in the sense of it being absolute, but it is agreed because it's agreed. And I don't know if I'm making the point I'm really wanting to make here, except to say that when we think about truth, the whole purpose of philosophy, in fact, there's a branch of philosophy called epistemology, which is about truth. What is true is that this is what's going to rise during this period of the Enlightenment, is a revision and a re-understanding of, quote unquote, what is true. And how do you know what is true? This is a philosophical question. It also happens to be a very important theological question. Questions, thoughts about that?
Well, what is?
Well, yeah, and that's an excellent point, Billy, because language gets into this too, right? Because in order to express a thought, you have to be able to express it in language. Language is not absolute, right?
Right.
You see this problem in English. Love. How many words do we have? We have multiple words for love in English, but what is the primary word for love in English?
Love.
Love. We all know from, New Testament Greek translated, there's how many words did the Greeks have for love?
It's three.
At least three, probably a fourth. We know of agape, we know of eros, we know of phileo, and then there's sort of a community love type of thing that exists, but certainly those three, agape, eros, and philos. Those are more descriptive. when we try to translate into English, we have to use adjectives in front of our love. Brotherly love, unconditional love, romantic love, in order to be able to express those things out. The same thing goes on in philosophy. And so one of the backdrops that's happening here Luther kicked this off. Let's understand what Luther did with the Reformation. Kicked off the question of belief. And so that's going on in theological circles, but it's also going on simultaneously in philosophical circles. And by the time we get to through the 16th century, that's the 1500s, that's during the Reformation, into the 17th century, that's the 1600s, as the Reformation is really carrying itself out. This philosophy is being influenced by the rise of enlightenment or the age of reason. And so it's important for us to spend a little time talking about that in a study of theology, because it's influencing theology. What Dr. Reeves just said, which is an important pickup from this, is particularly the Protestant movements start writing these things called confessions. Why would you write down a confession?
No clue.
So that there's a uniform thought.
Yeah, so that you can be more specific about what you believe and express it in such a way that someone that you don't even talk to, having a conversation with, can read and understand where you're coming from. We have a modern term for this. We often talk about getting on the same page with somebody. And that really is a function of the fact that we have writing systems and the ability to do that. In fact, just Thursday morning, I was at a meeting with some folks who were down in Mexico that spoke pretty good English, but I put together the summary notes from that meeting along with one of my colleagues, and I told them as we were concluding the call, I'm going to send you a summary of the meeting here so that we can all make sure we're on the same page, literally on the same page, because I had some concern about was anything lost in the language barriers between the two of us. So writing it down meant that people could look at it and go, yeah, that's it, or no, I understood it to be this. So there's a value to that. So that's what actually starts happening inside of theology and inside of particularly Protestant theology, is people start writing things down. They write these confessions.
And approximately what year was that?
This really kicks in big ways. In some ways, Calvin's a big thrust behind that. Luther writes some as well, but Calvin's Institutes of Religion is him explaining what's there. Certainly throughout the 16th into the rest of the 15th, the rest of the 1500s into the 1600s. So the 16th and 17th century is a big part of what goes on there. So, for example, we talked last week about as the Baptists were undergoing persecution and the various things that were happening in England. What ultimately happened in 1689 with the Act of Toleration is almost immediately what came on the backside of that was what? They wrote down a Baptist confession. This is in the setting of the scientific movement that's going on when things are being written down and more clearly defined. Newton publishes Principia, I think 1687 is the date, but it's within 10 years before that, without a doubt. So he writes down a treatise on how gravitation and motion works. And about the same time, Baptists are writing down, this is what we believe, because putting it in writing where people can see it becomes very important.
So the Protestants have been disagreeing and fighting for the last 500 years. Because once they put it,
yeah,
once you start writing it down,
in writing, yeah, then it's something to be contested, right?
Yeah, because then it's opinion as well.
Right. So I maybe I've taken the detour here too far, but I want you to understand that the backdrop here of the scientific revolution is impacting even the way theology is being done, and the Enlightenment is a big part of that.
Hey,
Fran, you have.
Go ahead.
You brought up the question, what is truth? And I couldn't help but remember that that's the question that Pilate asked Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is not a new question. We've been asking the question about what is true forever, right?
But I guess the thing I struggle with is like there had to have been something that changed, because when did people start questioning the truth? Because
The garden.
the what?
The garden.
No, I understand that, but like the well, that's true, but
Remember, Satan's attack is that what God told you isn't true.
Okay. Well, I guess as a kid, if somebody older than you, in authority to you, kind of told you that this is the way it was, it is our human nature. I mean, you see it in the 2-year-old. Don't touch that. You're going to get burned, and the kid still going ahead and touching that. I guess it's just the human nature to question the truth. But getting to that point where it's like, well, what's true for me and what's true for you, and then it's all relative. My truth is so much different than, the sky is blue, clouds are white, grass is green, kind of a thing. So I guess I do understand that, like, my background, the way I grew up, the time period that I grew up in, the family that I grew up in, all of those things influence the way I even see other people, because I assume that they look kind of like me. Their upbringing must be very similar to my upbringing, kind of a thing. They don't look like me. Their upbringing must be completely opposite of the way I grew up, type of a thing. But just that idea to really question truth, you're right. It goes all the way back to the garden.
But I do think there's a difference between questioning truth and questioning that there is truth. To me, when you talk about questioning truth, you're not doubting. You're not saying that something that your parents told you was true for them, but it's not true for you. You're questioning whether or not it is absolutely true. I think the issue we're dealing with here in postmodernism is that to believe in an absolute truth, you have to believe in a diviner of that absolute truth. And if you don't believe there is a God, then it's easy to go to the next step and say there is no such thing as absolute truth.
Right, because who has the right power and position to be the arbiter of that truth?
Exactly.
Not actually, I use bad terminology there. Not even the arbiter of that truth, but the origin of that truth. Those are two different
The author of truth.
Yeah, because it's one thing to be an arbiter of truth. You can be the arbiter of truth without creating the truth. It's another thing to be the author or the originator of the truth. And God is unique in that role. If you want, and you make the perfect point there, Doug, in the sense of absolutism. And absolutism has become a bad word inside of a lot of philosophical circles in postmodernism.
It's a skepticism of what has been held to be true.
Yeah, and to Doug's point, which I think is a valid point, skepticism is not bad in and of itself.
Right.
In fact, skepticism is a good thing in and of itself. We wouldn't be talking about this Reformation thing if Luther hadn't been skeptical.
Skeptical, yeah.
And so the skepticism is not the problem. It's how you approach the skepticism and what you do with the skepticism that can lead to, interesting places. There's one of the questions that, you get turned around in these philosophical things, also these conundrums really well. Descartes is the picture that's going to be on the screen. He's going to start talking about Descartes here in a minute, which is relevant. Kathy mentioned it earlier. She mentioned a color. So my favorite color is blue. When I see blue, is it the same thing that you see when you see blue?
Not necessarily.
I've often wondered that.
It's many shades of blue. So.
But I'm just talking about what we identify as blue. Do
Yeah.
you see? Well, and here's the problem with that is that we can both look at something. I'm wearing a green shirt today. I can wear green because I don't have a green background. I won't fade into it. So you see the green that I'm wearing today. You see, everybody agrees this is green, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kathy's wearing a different shade of green actually today. And here's, a different shade of green here on this clip. Those are all, everybody looks at that, goes, that's green.
Yep.
But when you see green in your head, the question that runs through my head every once in a while, more than it should, is in your head, does it look like my blue? But to call it green because that's your green. Does that make any sense?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, somebody else's green could be our blue.
Yeah. Now we don't have a problem because we've agreed upon the things that we see and agreed upon what they are. So when we see green, we see green. Now, if you're colorblind, that whole blue yellow thing is going to be a problem for you, or red green is going to be a problem for you. I think red green is the more common color blindness problem. So you might have difficulty distinguishing between, I've got a red mug here. You might have difficulty those all may look sort of gray or similar to you. But here's the problem with using this. It's a silly analogy, but it's an important analogy. Is there any way for us to ever know if our perception of the colors is the same or not?
Yes, by communication to each other.
Our identification of the colors through communication, but our perception we'll never know, because I can't be inside of Doug's head to see what he sees when he sees green and suddenly go, wait a second.
Eye transplant. What? Eye transplant.
Yeah. Well, and again, where do we even see color? How much of that is the organ versus how much of that is our brain, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, it's a problem we struggle with in medicine, and it's that pain. What I tell people this, because one of the things that we're supposed to do is ask about pain, and especially for kids, how do they describe pain? And now we've got the little smiley faces, and I mean, there's been millions of dollars spent trying to get pain scores and pain skills. But what really hurts me and what really hurts you there's no way for us to know if they're the same thing. We may have the same experience. I may break my elbow and Don may break his elbow, but that doesn't even mean that we experience pain in the same level at the same time and all of those things. So
we've covered several different examples here that may seem so esoteric and broad. What does this have to do with the Bible, right? Well, it has to do with our understanding of truth, and theology is our understanding of the ultimate truth of who God is revealed through his word, and the fact that we deal with relativism every day. So, Doug, I think you hit it very well. The problem is not whether it's okay to question truth. The question is, do you believe there is an absolute truth?
Right.
And the problem becomes, at what point does our widely enough help? By the way, I believe that when you see blue, you see the same thing that I do. That's because I believe that God created our organs and our sensory mechanisms in such a way that they're not distinct by person to person. So that's my rationale behind why I think your blue and my blue are the same thing. But I can never know that is the problem. I have to assume that, and ultimately it becomes a matter at that point, of faith, that I believe that. As ridiculous as that sounds, your perception of a color and my perception of the color ultimately becomes a matter of faith, because it cannot be proven scientifically. At least.
In this age of philosophy, opened up so many more schools of thought for people to understand and explain things.
Right.
That's why you have so many wavering views.
And they're competing views. And then the other thing, you heard me use this, one of my college professors said this, and it really stuck with me. And the example that he used is the one that I'll use here. It says, a widely enough held perception acts like reality. His point being, the reason people didn't go sailing across the Atlantic until they did was they believed that sailing across the Atlantic, the earth was flat, there was potential of falling off, whatever it was. Enough people believed that they acted as if it were true. It wasn't true, but it might as well have been true because everybody acted as if it were true. And in some ways, that's actually what was happening in Christian theology up until the Reformation. Is in so many things were so widely held inside the Orthodox singular little c Catholic Church that no one, whether it was true or not, it was so widely held, it acted as if it were true. And then we begin to have that unraveled. So the concept of questioning, skepticism, enlightenment, the age of reason, what it brings to the table is not bad. The dangerous thing is the places that it can lead towards, if that makes any sense. And this becomes the backdrop for where we're headed in our understanding of this part of the history of the church, and this part of the history and the evolution of theology is now we have this clash that's happening by the scientific method and philosophical approach that's clashing with how that works with theology.
The person of Descartes. Descartes was the man who argued, I think, therefore I am, which is one of the more overwrought and underappreciated slogans in all of the history of philosophy. Descartes essentially wants to find a grounding or a rationale for confidence in our ability to rationalize or reason our way to certain topics.
So does everybody know what Descartes meant here when he said, I think, therefore I am?
Wow.
By the way,
I think we could spend a whole lot of time talking about that. I always thought that meant because I can reason, I have reason to exist.
That's a pretty good way of describing it, Doug. Have any of you ever had that thought cross your mind of, do I really exist? Is this real? Which is a strange thought. I've had that thought at various points, is this real? Am I real? And Descartes was struggling with that is, how do I know that I'm real? Well, his point was the very fact that I'm asking the question of whether I'm real or not means I'm real.
Evidence.
It's prima facie evidence. I'm thinking about thinking, therefore I'm thinking. And what was he trying to get? He was actually trying to get to a very fundamental ground. Now back to this idea, truth is, how can there be anything? I mean, the ultimate relativism is, do I even exist? That's the ultimate relativism, right?
Yeah.
Is reality real? He's actually getting to that point and coming to saying, I'm actually going to have to take some of this actually based upon what? Based upon faith. I think, therefore I am. The fact that I can think tells me that I exist, because if I didn't exist, I wouldn't be thinking.
What kind of philosophy is this that you just said? There was a word that you used.
Oh.
Is it something that's credited with him?
Well, Cartesian is the broad word that's used. I didn't use that now. That's described him. This is fundamental. It's just fundamental epistemology about what is truth, what is existence.
So the scripture, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, is not what this is saying.
No, but it's connected, because the representation there that we were created as thinking beings. One of the questions of postmodernism, getting back to the idea of where does truth come from, and as Doug pointed out very well, absolute truth has to come from somebody who's the absolute creator of something that is objectively true, right? There's this question between subjective thought and objective thought. God created us to think and ponder who he was. we think, therefore we can ponder God, is another, another expression of Descartes' realization. But understand, Descartes is very much grounded in what we would think of as being science. It's a shame that Sherry's not here this week, because
Is that Sherry?
where?
Isn't that Sherry?
No, it's there. Oh, no, that's
Oh,
Billy. She saw your ichthus and thought it was Sherry's pie,
that's
Billy.
right.
Actually coordinate systems. Latitude and longitude are a form of Cartesian coordinates, x-axis, y-axis kind of thing. That Cartesian coordinate system comes out of Descartes. He's big in math. Sherry would tell you that Descartes is big in math. So there's the interesting correlation there between mathematics, which we think of as being this very discrete science, and philosophy. Descartes dabbling in both of them here.
In many ways, he's very much like a late medieval theologian or philosopher, something like Aquinas. All these thinkers in the Middle Ages are debating the limits of faith and reason. Descartes is really in this category, but where Descartes goes is not towards the scriptures, not towards the Bible as either the sole foundation for our intellectual understanding of God and truth, nor does he see it as part of the equation per se. The slogan, "I think, therefore I am," in other words, becomes a real individualistic appreciation that because I can be confident that if I'm thinking, I'm not being made to think. Therefore, the fact that I am thinking things itself is a given, doesn't have to be proven. And from that, he builds up a case of what we today call epistemology, which is how do we know anything? Descartes' answer is, I know because I am knowing. And if I'm knowing something, the very fact that I know anything means that I'm thinking it. Therefore, because I'm thinking, I must exist. Now, again, this is one of those great moments in philosophy, particularly for new students, where they get a little bit of brain cramp going on, trying to figure out why he is arguing this. And we're not going to go into this now, but what we're seeing happen here is a development within the areas of philosophy that are going to begin moving step by step towards Enlightenment philosophy.
It also just struck me, it hadn't hit me until now, thinking back to Exodus. Moses is out on the backside of the desert, sees a bush that's burning, but not burning. Challenges his understanding of reality, by the way, at that point. That's challenging his understanding of truth, because what he had seen before that fire did and what he's seeing now is different. So he goes there, has that conversation with God. Remember what the question is that Moses asks of God. Okay, you want me to go and tell these people, you're going to deliver them. They're going to ask me, who sent you? What was God's response?
I am what I am.
I am. It just struck me as I saw there on the screen, the idea of how connected that is in some ways to what Descartes was saying. I think, therefore I am. God is saying, I am. Therefore, I am. God. The reason I exist as God is because I exist as God. That didn't strike me until just now. I don't know if that strikes you in any way, but seeing the similarity of how we're wired from our creator God in that sense, just struck me there all of a sudden. How does God prove his existence? In a similar, or to a man in a similar way that Descartes did, it is because it is. I am because I am.
Increasingly away from traditional foundations of the church or the Bible, and increasingly in favor of rational thought and philosophy as the foundation of where they're going. Okay, so that's philosophy and theology. What about the arts? What about...
Okay. We'll stop there. We're not going to go off into the arts and music, but obviously there's the influence that goes on there.
So
again,
maybe that part of philosophy is still man trying to be equal to God, since God said, I am, I am. And now seems like he's saying the same thing.
I think, therefore I'm God.
Well, and that actually becomes an extension of the ultimate element of relativism and postmodernism, is that why is my truth any different than God's truth, right? It's all relative. That's the dangerous place that it goes.
Yeah.
Or questions or thoughts? Again, does everybody understand why this is sort of relevant to our discussion about theology? Why we have to bring in the changes that are going on in philosophy to better understand how things were being challenged?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is going to be influencing the language that is used. And so by influencing the language, then it's going to influence the discussion.
Correct. And not only that, but what actually happens sort of yet again, but happens in the most profound way that it's going to happen, this is particularly into the 18th, particularly in very much so into the 19th century, as we have the real, I'll just use the word cynical, the cynical age of the age of reason. You know, now we're talking
Yeah.
about Voltaire and many of the other things. If you've ever read any Nietzsche, for example, you know, a lot of this actually arises in German thought, but tends to be where a lot of it gets contained. French thought in Voltaire and German thought in Nietzsche is it becomes very acerbic, very attacking of what we would think of as being traditional Christian theology. And everything we know about Scripture starts being placed under attack from a scientific approach. So we've talked about this a little bit before. If I use the term documentary hypothesis, does anybody know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
It's this
Hey.
idea that Genesis and the books that we know as the books of Moses are a compilation of 4 different sources, the JEDP ways that you see this expressed, that it's actually a synthesis of multiple things that were compiled together by a later editor.
Yeah.
The documentary hypothesis grows to being an absurdly popular notion, even among Christian theologians in the 19th century. It comes out of, it's actually referred to as the German school of approaching this. And it's the result of applying scientific method to interpreting Scripture in such a way that the question even causes, was that all written as one book to begin with? I can see this link, that word is used there for God. The J word, that's where the J comes from, using Jehovah versus I can see Elohim being used over here. So those must have been 2 different authors writing, and this has been melded together. This is where this scientific thing that explodes here through the age of reason and the age of enlightenment starts having a very critical, in fact, critical is the word that's used, it's schools of criticism, biblical criticism that arise that happen, again, primarily in the 18th and 19th century. These come out of the start of what's happening here in the 17th century. We are still wrestling with those things today. Questions, thoughts? You didn't know you were getting Philosophy 101 today, did you? But our philosophy and our theology tie together. The last thing I want to say that's a good thing that came out of this is things like confessions and systematic theologies that we have today, the references that we use to understand theology, being organized, written, and expressed in systematic ways is a good outflow of this skeptical view of theology. We get good things out of it too.
Music. What about
discoveries? What about all these wonderful things?
Questions, thoughts? So where we're going to go next is we'll spend a little bit more time looking at this, because we'll also look at the scientific method. Then we'll do an overview of the Age of Reason, which is the backdrop for the rest of a lot of the theological development in the 17th and 18th centuries. And then we're going to circle back around to the rise of Methodism, which is an early 19th century phenomena in England, but how it influences Baptist thought and other Protestant thought, even in the United States. And then we're ultimately going to finish circling back around with that to the rest of the story of how Baptists evolved, particularly in North America, theologically and in an organizational sense, to sort of bring us up to the modern place where we are now. So that's sort of the path that we go forward. Obviously, when we talk about Methodism, we'll end up picking up the things that flow from that, which are the Pentecostals flow out of that. And we'll pick up the other things that flow out of Baptists, Church of Christ, Seventh-day Adventists, those types of things, and seeing how all of that connects to bring us forward.
Don, when the Baptist religion or thing started, had the King James version of the Bible already been written? If not, what did we use, the Baptists use then?
At the very time that what we would think of as being the first modern Baptist churches were rising, and we talked a little bit about this last week and the week before, which is the early 1600s, so the early 17th century it is the period of time that's arising, 1607 to 1609. King James Version is in 1611. So the King James English Bible is thrust upon the scene at about the time in England that that what we would recognize theologically and from the other things that we've talked about as Baptists were emerging. They're at the same time.
Okay.
And to the extent that they were reading a Bible in English, which many of them were, they were probably reading Tyndall's translation, Coverdale's translation. So much of the King James Bible is directly lifted and stolen from Tyndall and Wycliffe. That they were reading much of the same things we see in the King James, just in the things that ended up feeding into the King James. Sort of the place I think that we will land and end up here when we're done with the next 2 to 3 weeks of covering the rest of that historical perspective is I want us to go back and look at some of these confessions that were referenced here, like the Westminster Confession, the London Baptist Confession. And I want us to look at those in a little bit of detail. We're not going to go into much detail there, but remember, if we go way, way back in our study, we covered things like the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, those various creeds, seeing how these modern confessions tie back to those now much, much older written statements of what we believe. And you'll see how much God has preserved the same thought, but you'll also see how these things expand out and expound upon what's there. I think that's sort of a neat thing to do, is to look at, for example, the Westminster Confession and who it says God is compared to the Nicene Creed and who it says God is. And you're going to see that God has done a really good job of preserving in writing an understanding of who he is, even as it's being expanded in something like the Westminster Confession. Questions, thoughts?
Are we going to continue more with philosophy next week?
A little bit more, but it won't be as much about the philosophical side of the Age of Reason as it will be just about like Francis Bacon and some of the others that are introducing the scientific method, because it comes to be a
Lock.
well, yeah, well, and
You just scratched the surface.
Yeah, and again, the thing that happens here is what is definitely going on in the moves of philosophy that are happening here. They touch theology. They most definitely touch political thought in huge ways. You know, Locke, Rousseau, prior to that, Hobbes, you know, don't get me started because that's what my degree's in, but there are all kinds of things that are flowing there. And then I am going to show you, I think Ryan Reeves does a really good job of it in one of the videos. There's a need for us to debunk a little bit of what I will call American foundational theology myths about what's true about our understanding of who the Pilgrims and the early religious followers in the US were, but also what's a little bit wrong about that. The oversimplification of that can cause us to think some things that I believe are important to have a little bit of, here we come, healthy skepticism about, so that we don't get ourselves caught in thinking about that so simplistically that we don't realize the nuances of how it plays down to today. And that will also allow us to touch again on the importance, which we've seen a great deal of throughout this thing, of the role that particularly Baptists have played in the concept of religious liberty, which is huge. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts before I kill the recording? And everybody can, except for Diana, who's been the brave one, who's been here all along. All right. I'm going to stop the recording now.